The violin's sweet melody filled the elegant drawing room in New York. David Freeman, dressed in his finest navy vest, bowed gracefully as the evening's final notes faded into appreciative applause. The wealthy guests raised their champagne glasses, their laughter echoing through the warm, candle-lit space. This was just another ordinary evening for a free man living the American dream in 1853. But just 3 days later, everything changed. David's eyes cracked open to suffocating darkness. Heavy iron shackles bit deep into his wrists, the metal already stained with his blood. The stench of human waste and despair filled his nostrils. A harsh voice cut through the silence. Well, well. The runaway slave finally woke up. David struggled to sit up, his head spinning violently. "I'm not a slave! I'm David Freeman, a free citizen of New York!" His voice cracked with desperation and confusion. Cruel laughter echoed in the cramped cell. "Freeman, your name is Platt now, boy, and you'll be our property until the day you die." The nightmare that would consume 12 years of David's life had just begun. 10 days earlier, the Freeman household on Catherine Street buzzed with the comfortable rhythm of family life. David sat at their modest wooden table, carefully counting the evening's earnings while his wife Eliza prepared dinner. Their 2 children, 7-year-old Anne and 5-year-old Marcus, played nearby. The crisp white shirt David wore still carried the scent of the afternoon's performance, but his face glowed with satisfaction. Tonight's payment would cover Anne's reading books and Marcus's new shoes. "Papa, will you teach me to play the violin like you?" Anne tugged at David's sleeve, her bright eyes full of admiration. David smiled warmly, running his calloused fingers through her hair. In a society where most Black Americans faced endless barriers, David had managed to carve out a respectable living through his musical talent. His ability to read, write, and perform classical music made him a sought-after entertainer among New York's upper class. It wasn't wealth, but it was dignity and freedom. 2 days later, opportunity knocked on their door in the form of 2 well-dressed strangers. Hamilton and Parker, they introduced themselves, wore expensive tailored coats, and carried themselves with the confidence of successful businessmen. Their proposal seemed like a gift from heaven. Join a traveling circus as a featured violinist, touring the southern states for just a few weeks. The pay was $1 per day, more money than David typically earned in a week. "We've heard remarkable things about your musical abilities," Hamilton said, his smile broad but his eyes strangely cold. This could be the beginning of a very profitable partnership. Eliza gripped David's hand tightly, her instincts warning her of something wrong, but the promise of financial security was too tempting to ignore. Their family needed the money desperately. The farewell dinner took place at an upscale tavern downtown. Hamilton and Parker insisted on celebrating their new business arrangement with the finest wine and richest food. David felt honored to be treated as an equal by these distinguished gentlemen. The conversation flowed as smoothly as the alcohol, covering topics from classical music to the growing tensions between North and South. As the evening progressed, David's vision began to blur, and his words became increasingly slurred. The last thing he remembered was Hamilton's concerned voice saying, "You don't look well, my friend. Perhaps you should rest." When consciousness returned, David found himself in a nightmarish reality that defied all logic. William's slave pen in Washington, D.C., was a perfectly legal business in 1853, specializing in the capture and sale of human beings. The irony was devastating. In the nation's capital, where the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men were created equal, men like James Birch had perfected the art of transforming free citizens into property. Listen carefully, slave." Birch's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had destroyed countless lives. His leather whip slapped rhythmically against his palm as he spoke. "Your name is Platt. You were born in Georgia. You can't read or write, and you've never been free. Remember this story, because if you tell anyone different, I'll beat you to death." David tried to protest, tried to explain about his wife, his children, his life in New York. The response was swift and brutal, a savage beating that left him bloody and broken on the filthy floor. For 3 days, David clung to hope that someone would realize the mistake. He told his story to anyone who would listen, begging guards and visitors to contact his family in New York. But in this place, truth held no power. Only violence spoke with authority. The other prisoners, David slowly realized, were all in similar situations. Free black men who had been drugged, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. Some had been free their entire lives. Others had purchased their freedom legally, only to have their papers stolen and their identities erased. On the 4th day, David understood the terrible reality. His previous life had been completely erased. The well-dressed violinist who had earned respect through talent and education no longer existed. In his place stood Platt, a piece of property worth approximately $1,200 on the New Orleans slave market. The transformation was complete, and the true horror was just beginning. The steamboat journey down the Red River toward Louisiana felt like a descent into the deepest circles of hell. If Washington, D.C. had been a nightmare, the Deep South was where nightmares came to die and spawn even worse horrors. David stood chained to dozens of other human beings on the deck, watching the landscape change from familiar northern forests to the endless cotton fields that built southern fortunes on human suffering. His first master, William Ford, proved to be a contradiction that tormented David's sense of justice. Ford was an educated man, a preacher who genuinely believed in Christian charity, yet somehow managed to reconcile his faith with owning other human beings. Under Ford's ownership, David's intelligence became both a blessing and a curse. The master recognized David's abilities and assigned him complex tasks, building bridges, designing transportation systems for lumber, even creating mechanical innovations that improved plantation efficiency. "Platt seems different from the others," Ford remarked to his wife one evening, unaware that David could hear every word from the nearby workshop. "There's something about his manner, his way of thinking, almost as if he's had some education." David continued his work, carefully hiding his literacy while his mind screamed in frustration. Every day he was forced to pretend ignorance while his knowledge could have revolutionized Ford's entire operation. But David learned the most crucial lesson of survival: never reveal your true capabilities. When other slaves couldn't read work instructions, David pretended to be equally confused. When Ford asked for suggestions about improving plantation operations, David offered ideas hesitantly, as if they were lucky guesses rather than educated solutions. The mask of ignorance became his shield against suspicion and jealousy. Unfortunately, even kindness couldn't protect David from the economic realities of slavery. Ford's mounting debts forced him to sell David to John Tibeats, a carpenter whose cruelty matched his incompetence. Tibeats was everything Ford was not: brutal, ignorant, and filled with rage toward any slave who seemed to possess dignity. From their first meeting, David sensed that Tibeats viewed him as a personal threat. "I don't like the way you look at me, boy," Tibeats snarled during David's first day, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "You think you're better than me? I'll show you what happens to uppity slaves who forget their place." The carpenter's jealousy was pathological. Every time David's intelligence showed through, even accidentally, Tibeats responded with increasing violence. The breaking point came when David corrected a serious error in Tibeats' construction plans. The mistake would have caused a building to collapse, potentially killing workers. David's suggestion was offered respectfully, humbly, but Tibeats interpreted it as an unforgivable challenge to his authority. The carpenter exploded in rage, grabbing his bullwhip and attacking David with savage fury. But 18 months of hard labor had transformed David's body. The gentleman violinist was gone, replaced by a man with iron muscles and desperate determination. When Tibeats raised the whip again, David fought back. He grabbed the leather weapon and turned it against his tormentor, beating Tibeats until the man begged for mercy. For one brief moment, David felt the intoxicating rush of justice. In civilized society, this would have been called self-defense. In Louisiana, it was a capital crime. News of the incident spread quickly through the local plantation network. David was now marked as a dangerous slave who had committed the ultimate sin, fighting back against a white man. He fled into the treacherous swamplands, living like a hunted animal for 2 weeks, surviving on whatever food he could scavenge while tracking dogs searched for his scent. When hunger and exhaustion finally drove him back to seek Ford's protection, David discovered that his fate had already been decided. Standing in Ford's parlor was a man whose very name caused slaves to whisper prayers for mercy. Edward Graves. If Tibeats had been cruel, Graves was evil incarnate. So this is the slave who thinks he can beat white men. Graves examined David like a buyer inspecting livestock. His cold grey eyes showed no emotion whatsoever as he looked over David's scars and muscle development. "I've heard interesting stories about you, Platt. They say you're smart. They say you have pride. Well, I specialize in breaking smart, proud slaves." Ford handed over the ownership papers with obvious reluctance, but debt and law left him no choice. Graves' plantation operated under entirely different rules than anything David had experienced. Here, torture wasn't punishment for wrongdoing. It was entertainment for a sadistic master who had lost all connection to human decency. David witnessed horrors that would haunt his dreams for decades: slaves beaten to death for minor infractions, families separated for Graves' amusement, and systematic cruelties that served no purpose except satisfying one man's twisted psychology. Among Graves' victims was Ruth, a 19-year-old girl who had been chosen as the master's personal victim. Every night, her screams echoed from the main house, while David lay in the slave quarters, his fists clenched in helpless rage. When Ruth asked him why he didn't try to help her, David was forced to give the most painful answer of his life. "If I try to save you, we'll both be killed, and nothing will change. Sometimes survival is the only form of resistance we have." The discovery that sealed David's despair came during his 3rd month under Graves' ownership, a midnight burial in the forest behind the plantation. Graves wasn't just torturing slaves, he was murdering them and hiding the evidence. The realization that his own death could come at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, pushed David to the very edge of surrender. 8 years had passed since David Freeman had ceased to exist, replaced entirely by Platt the slave. David had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear his real name spoken aloud. The elegant violinist who once earned applause in New York drawing rooms had been buried beneath layers of survival, brutality, and the constant performance of ignorance required to stay alive. His hands, once nimble on violin strings, were now permanently calloused from cotton sacks and farm tools, his back curved from years of bending under the weight of impossible loads. But the cruelest torture wasn't physical pain. It was the gradual death of hope. David had attempted to send letters home twice during his early years with Graves. The first time, he had secretly written to his wife Eliza, using makeshift ink created from berries and charcoal, hiding the message in the clothing of a slave who was being granted freedom. That letter never reached its destination. The second attempt had been even more devastating. David trusted a white merchant who promised to mail his desperate plea for help, but the man immediately reported David's literacy to Graves instead. The punishment for that second letter had been unspeakable. Graves had suspended David from a tree for an entire day, the rope around his neck tight enough to cause agony, but not death. "The next time you try to contact anyone," Graves had whispered while cleaning David's blood from his whip. "I'll cut off your fingers one by one until you can't hold a pen." From that moment forward, David had buried his hope so deep that he almost convinced himself it had died completely. Then Samuel Hale arrived to change everything. Hale was a Canadian carpenter contracted to build additional slave quarters on Graves's plantation. At 40 years old, he possessed something that David had almost forgotten existed: genuine human decency. Unlike every other white man David had encountered in the South, Hale never barked orders or demanded immediate obedience. Instead, he said "please" and "thank you" when asking for assistance, treating slaves like human beings rather than farm equipment. "Could you hand me that hammer, please?" Hale asked David during their first day working together. David passed the tool, but Hale didn't take it immediately. Instead, he looked directly into David's eyes, something that white men simply didn't do with slaves. "Thank you very much. I'm Samuel Hale, by the way. What's your name?" The question was so unexpected that David almost forgot to use his slave identity. "Platt," he answered automatically. But something in Hale's expression suggested the man wasn't entirely convinced. Over the following days, David and Hale worked side by side on construction projects. Their conversations began with discussions about wood grain and construction techniques, but gradually evolved into something deeper. Hale spoke about his life in Canada, about a society where slavery had been abolished, about his belief that all men deserved freedom, regardless of skin color. David found himself responding with increasing eloquence, his educated vocabulary occasionally slipping through the mask of ignorance he had maintained for so long. "You know," Hale said one afternoon while they measured lumber, "you speak very well for someone who supposedly never learned to read." The comment hung in the air between them like a challenge. David felt his heart racing as he realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. But instead of fear, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the possibility of being truly seen by another human being. The moment of truth came during Graves's absence on a business trip to New Orleans. David and Hale were working alone when the Canadian carpenter set down his tools and spoke directly. "Platt, or whoever you really are, I know you weren't born into slavery. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. If you want to tell me your real story, I promise it will go no further than necessary." David stared at this white man who was offering something no one had given him in 8 years: the chance to be believed. The risk was enormous. If Hale reported him to Graves, David would be tortured to death. But looking into those honest blue eyes, David made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "My name is David Freeman," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm from New York. I have a wife named Eliza and 2 children. I was a free man until I was kidnapped and sold into slavery." Hale listened without interruption as David poured out his entire story: the deception by Hamilton and Parker, the nightmare of Williams's slave pen, the years of hiding his education and enduring Graves' cruelties. When David finished, Hale was quiet for a long moment before asking, "Can you write a letter?" David nodded, hardly daring to hope. "Then write one," Hale said firmly. "I'll make sure it reaches the right people no matter what it costs me." That night, David wrote the most important letter of his life, by candlelight, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He addressed it to Henry Parker, a lawyer who had been a family friend in New York, carefully explaining his situation and pleading for legal intervention. Every word was chosen with precision, knowing this might be his only chance to reclaim his identity and freedom. When David handed the letter to Hale the next morning, both men understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. "If this doesn't work," David began, but Hale cut him off with quiet determination. "It will work," he said. "Some things are more important than personal safety. If I don't help you, I couldn't live with myself." The bond between them transcended race, class, and the legal barriers that defined Southern society. It was simply one human being refusing to abandon another in desperate need. But as Hale prepared to leave the plantation with David's letter hidden in his boot, Graves returned unexpectedly from New Orleans, his suspicious eyes immediately focusing on the Canadian carpenter who had spent too much time talking with his most valuable slave. "Open that bag," Graves commanded, pointing at Hale's travel satchel with the cold authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. David stood frozen 20 feet away, watching his last hope potentially crumble into disaster. Inside that bag lay the tools of Hale's trade, personal belongings, and somewhere hidden in his boot, the letter that could either save David's life or end both their lives in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Hale complied with steady hands, unpacking his carpenter's tools, spare clothing, and dried food supplies onto Graves's porch. The plantation owner searched through every item with the thoroughness of a man who trusted no one, his fingers probing every pocket and crevice. David's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Graves examine each piece of Hale's property. The letter remained hidden in the carpenter's boot, but discovery seemed inevitable with each passing second. "Everything appears to be in order," Graves finally conceded, his disappointment obvious. He had been hoping to find evidence of something, anything, that would justify his suspicions about the relationship between Hale and his most intelligent slave. "Next time, don't make me wonder about your intentions." Hale nodded respectfully, repacked his belongings, and walked toward his wagon without looking back at David. Only after the Canadian had disappeared completely did David learn the truth. The letter had been carefully sewn into the leather sole of Hale's left boot, a hiding place that had required genuine courage to create and maintain. The months that followed tested David's sanity in ways that physical torture never could. Every approaching horse, every unfamiliar visitor, every unexpected sound caused his heart to race with desperate hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Hale had promised the letter would reach its destination, but the silence stretched on without any sign of response or rescue. David began to wonder if he had imagined the entire encounter, if desperation had driven him to hallucinate the one person who had treated him like a human being. During this period of agonizing uncertainty, David became Ruth's closest friend and protector. The young woman had endured years of Graves's sexual violence, her spirit battered but not completely broken. In their whispered conversations during brief rest periods, David shared stories of his life in New York, painting pictures of a world where black families lived in freedom and dignity. These conversations became Ruth's lifeline to hope and David's way of maintaining his own sanity. "David," Ruth said one evening, using his real name when no one else could hear, "do you really believe we'll ever be free?" Her question carried the weight of someone who had suffered too much to easily trust in happy endings. David looked into her eyes, seeing reflections of his own doubts and fears, but also glimpses of the strength that had kept them both alive. "I have to believe it," he answered honestly. "Because the alternative is to surrender everything that makes us human." David began teaching Ruth to read and write, using sticks to scratch letters into the dirt during their lunch breaks. The lessons were incredibly dangerous since literate slaves faced severe punishment, including amputation of fingers. But David felt compelled to share the gift of education that had sustained him through his darkest hours. These secret lessons became acts of rebellion against a system designed to keep them ignorant and powerless. "Why are you risking so much for me?" Ruth asked during one of their clandestine reading sessions. David paused in his instruction, considering the question seriously before responding. "Because if we don't help each other, we lose everything that makes us who we are. They can own our bodies, but they can't own our minds unless we let them." The simple act of teaching Ruth to spell her own name became a profound declaration of their shared humanity. Graves's suspicions about their relationship grew stronger as he observed their interactions. The plantation owner possessed the paranoid instincts of a man who knew his cruelty created enemies everywhere, and he began watching David and Ruth with increasing attention. One night, he discovered Ruth practicing her letters in the dirt outside the slave quarters, evidence of literacy that could only have come from another slave's instruction. "Who taught you to write?" Graves grabbed Ruth's hair and yanked her head back violently, his voice carrying the promise of terrible consequences. Ruth looked toward David, who stood among the other slaves watching the confrontation, but she shook her head firmly. "I taught myself, master." She lied, her voice steady despite her obvious terror. "I copied letters I saw on grain sacks and other places." "Taught yourself?" Graves' laughter was cruel and disbelieving. "I'll show you what happens to slaves who get too educated for their own good." That night, Graves made David pay the price for Ruth's literacy, even though the girl had refused to implicate him. The plantation owner hanged David from the massive oak tree behind the main house, the rope positioned to cause maximum suffering without quite killing him. David's feet barely touched the ground, his full weight supported by the noose around his neck for hours, while Graves sat nearby drinking whiskey and making casual conversation. "You think you're special, don't you?" Graves asked conversationally, while David struggled to breathe. "You think you're different from the other animals I own? Let me tell you something, Platt. You're nothing but property, and property doesn't think, doesn't teach, and certainly doesn't have opinions about its situation." David focused all his energy on survival, drawing mental pictures of Eliza and their children to maintain consciousness, while his body screamed in agony. When dawn finally came, Graves cut David down and let him collapse to the ground, his throat raw and bleeding, but his spirit somehow unbroken. Ruth ran to him immediately, cradling his damaged body while tears streamed down her face. "Please don't die," she whispered desperately. "Don't leave me alone in this place." David managed to speak, despite his injured throat. "I won't die," he promised hoarsely. "I won't give him that satisfaction." The hanging incident marked a turning point in David's psychological survival. Rather than breaking his spirit, the near-death experience strengthened his resolve to outlast Graves' cruelty and live to see justice served. He continued teaching Ruth in even more secretive ways, using hand signals and spoken codes that couldn't be detected by watching eyes. Their friendship became a beacon of humanity in the midst of systematic dehumanization. As autumn arrived in David's 11th year of captivity, rumors began circulating among the slave communities about northern investigators searching for illegally enslaved free men. David allowed himself to feel the faintest stirring of hope while maintaining the careful emotional distance that had kept him sane for so long. Then, on a crisp October morning in his 12th year of slavery, a well-dressed stranger arrived at Graves' plantation, carrying official documents and asking specific questions about a slave called Platt. "I'm looking for a man named David Freeman," the stranger announced, his authoritative voice cutting through the morning air like a bell of liberation. "Also known as Platt." David was working in the cotton fields when those words reached his ears, causing him to drop his picking sack and stand motionless among the white plants that had defined his existence for 12 endless years. After more than a decade of believing his real name had been erased from the world, hearing it spoken aloud felt like witnessing his own resurrection. Graves emerged from the main house, his face already darkening with suspicion and anger. "There's no David Freeman here," he declared flatly. "Only slaves that belong to me, and I have the legal papers to prove it." But the stranger, who introduced himself as Henry Parker, was clearly prepared for such resistance. He produced an official leather portfolio containing documents that bore government seals and signatures from New York legal authorities. "I represent the state of New York and have been authorized to locate and recover David Freeman, a free citizen who was illegally kidnapped and sold into slavery," Parker stated with calm professional authority. His presence commanded respect in a way that transcended the usual social dynamics of the plantation. "I need to speak with the slave you call Platt." Graves' face turned purple with rage, but he couldn't legally refuse a request backed by federal authority. David approached the two men with careful steps, his heart pounding so violently he feared it might burst. After 12 years of careful performance, dropping his slave persona felt more terrifying than maintaining it. "Are you David Freeman?" Parker asked, looking directly into David's eyes with the same human recognition that Hale had shown years earlier. David glanced toward Graves, who stood nearby with his hand resting on his pistol, then made the decision that would reclaim his identity. "Yes," David said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I am David Freeman. I was born a free man in New York. My father was Joshua Freeman, and I lived on Catherine Street with my wife Eliza and my children Anne and Marcus." As he spoke his family's names aloud for the first time in 12 years, David felt pieces of his true self clicking back into place like a puzzle being reassembled. Parker nodded with satisfaction and turned to face Graves with legal documents extended. "Mr. Graves, I hereby notify you that this man is a free citizen who has been illegally held in bondage. You are required by federal law to release him immediately." Graves' response was explosive and predictable. "That's my property. I paid good money for that slave, and I have bills of sale to prove ownership." But Parker remained unmoved by the plantation owner's rage. "No one can legally own a free citizen," Parker replied firmly. "Your bills of sale are fraudulent documents based on illegal kidnapping. If you attempt to prevent this man's release, you will face federal charges." The confrontation represented everything David had dreamed about during his darkest moments, the system of laws and justice finally working to protect him rather than destroy him. Before leaving the plantation forever, David turned to find Ruth among the assembled slaves who had gathered to witness this unprecedented scene. The young woman stood with tears streaming down her face, her expression mixing joy for David's freedom with grief for her own continued captivity. "Ruth," David called out, using her real name in front of everyone for the first time. "Remember what I taught you. Education is freedom, and someday you'll use yours to help others." The journey back to New York took 3 weeks by train and steamboat, but every mile carried David further from the nightmare and closer to the life that had been stolen from him. Parker provided him with proper clothing and treated him with the dignity of a fellow citizen, but David found himself struggling to believe that his freedom was real. 12 years of slavery had taught him that hope was dangerous and happiness was temporary. When the train finally pulled into New York's Grand Central Station, David stepped onto the platform wearing a modest suit that Parker had purchased for him. The bustling city looked exactly as he remembered, but everything felt different when viewed through eyes that had seen the absolute worst of human nature. David walked slowly toward Catherine Street, his steps growing heavier as he approached the address that had lived in his memory like a sacred place. The house looked smaller and more weathered than his memories suggested, but it was unmistakably home. David stood on the front steps for several minutes, unable to raise his hand to knock. 12 years had passed. Anne would now be 19 years old, Marcus 17. Would they even remember their father? Would Eliza have remarried, assuming he was dead? The questions terrified him more than Graves's whip ever had. Finally, David knocked. The door opened to reveal Eliza, her hair now streaked with gray, and her face marked by years of worry and loss. She stared at him in complete silence for what felt like an eternity before whispering, "David." Her voice carried 12 years of grief, hope, and disbelief in a single word. "Yes," he answered softly. "I'm home." Their reunion was wordless at first, just two people holding each other and crying away years of separation and pain. Anne and Marcus appeared in the doorway, now young adults who had grown up believing their father was dead. Recognition came slowly, but when Anne finally said, "Papa," and ran into his arms, David felt his heart healing in ways he hadn't thought possible. The family spent hours sharing their stories, Eliza's struggles to support their children alone, Anne's education and dreams of becoming a teacher, Marcus's apprenticeship with a local craftsman. In the months that followed, David wrote his memoirs with the help of sympathetic abolitionists, documenting every detail of his 12-year ordeal. His testimony helped prosecute the men who had kidnapped him and contributed to the growing movement against slavery. He spoke at churches, schools, and public gatherings, using his experience to educate others about the realities of American slavery. 1 year after his return, David received a letter from Louisiana. Ruth had been freed when Graves faced financial ruin following David's legal case. She had indeed opened a school for former slaves, just as she had promised. "Dear David," she wrote, "I'm teaching children to read and write every day. They will never have to endure what we endured. Your lessons saved more than just my life." David's story had become proof that human dignity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, and that one person's courage could create ripples of justice that lasted for generations.